Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday, it's the day that we commemorate and celebrate Jesus coming into Jerusalem to the acclamation of a great crowd of people. I remember hearing this story as a boy every year in church and seeing the representations of Jesus riding. It was probably like a picture maybe printed on the church bulletin. But seeing these representations of Jesus riding in and just thinking, and it was like a happy day in church. You know, even in a pretty traditional liturgical church, it was a happy day. And I remember just thinking, Palm Sunday, it's nice. It's happy. What I didn't realize was the contrast, because nobody had ever taught it to me. And of course, when you're 8, you don't care about these things anyway. But I'd never realized the contrast between Jesus riding into Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey literally known, the animal, as a symbol of peace, in contrast with the ride that Pontius Pilate took into Jerusalem just a week earlier on a war horse. And literally, those were the two rides into Jerusalem. One a symbol of the way of war, and the other a symbol of the way of peace. And of course, another thing we never wondered about as children is where the Palm Sunday crowd came from, lining that road into Jerusalem. Like you went to church and all of a sudden there was a crowd on the road and everybody was shouting and you said, wow, this is pretty amazing. And we never really wondered, well, how did that happen? And the truth is that crowd had been gathering steam and gathering size for several days since the events that had happened in Jericho, where the corrupt tax collector, a friend of mine once referred to him as the local mafioso, the corrupt tax collector Zacchaeus had shared a meal with Jesus and then shocked the community by giving away half of his possessions to the poor and paying back fourfold everybody he'd been cheating basically for years. And if you think that's just a nice Bible story, imagine a politician doing that today. Imagine any politician, I'm not being partisan, imagine any politician standing up and saying, so here's the truth, I've been lying and cheating a lot over the years, and I'd like to make it right, I'd like to make it more than right. We'd all be like, is this a new angle? Is he playing? But this is what happened, and so it was the biggest thing that had ever happened in Jericho. It made this big stir. And then as Jesus is coming out of Jericho, he heals not one, but 2 blind men who are well known to the community. And all of this makes such a stir that people follow Jesus out of Jericho toward Jerusalem, which is no small thing, by the way, because Jericho actually sits 1,200 feet below sea level and is surrounded by mountains. So you have to go up to get out, then you go down again, and then you go up again because Jerusalem is 3,700 feet higher than Jericho. So it's no small walk. Now, maybe some of those people that follow Jesus were saying like, well, Passover's not too far off, we're going to head to Jerusalem anyway, this big Jesus thing is going on, so we may as well go now. I don't know. But Jesus actually ends up heading to Bethany, which is this little town a couple of miles outside Jerusalem, where he had often stayed when he was in Jerusalem at the home of his friends. And he definitely goes there this time because a few days earlier, when he's still in the mountains, he receives a message that his friend Lazarus, who lives in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha, is very ill. And John notes that despite this news that Jesus gets, that Lazarus is very ill, he still stays where he is 2 more days. So Jesus tells the disciples, finally, he says, hey, we need to head to Jerusalem. And the disciples basically say, this is all in John chapter 11, the disciples basically say, that's probably not really a great idea because the last time you were there, they tried to stone you to death. So not sure this is our smartest tactical move. And Jesus says to them in John 11:11, our friend Lazarus is sleeping, and I'm going there to wake him up. And the disciples say, well, if he's sleeping, if he's just resting, then he'll get better. And at this point, Jesus literally just looks at them and says, Lazarus is dead. They kind of go, oh. So let me read you this next part, beginning in John chapter 11, verse 17. So when Jesus came, he found that that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Now Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house. And Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" And she said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." So then Martha goes and she calls her sister Mary, and Mary, kind of has the same sentiment. If you had been here, if you had been here, but you weren't. And I think to try to picture this moment after Jesus comes from Jericho and he comes to Bethany, and Lazarus is in the tomb, and he's there with Mary and Martha and all this crowd, the crowd that came with him and the crowd that's there because of their loss. I think you really have to try to use your imagination if you want to grasp this scene, because there's a lot going on here. I imagine that when Jesus diverts to Bethany, people in the crowd that followed him up from Jericho are wondering why. He goes off the road to Jerusalem and he goes over to Bethany, and people are like, "Well, I thought he was going to Jerusalem." But maybe they've encountered people on the road going the other way who have brought news that Lazarus has died. And so I imagine that this crowd travels with Jesus into Bethany. And you have to realize, to get this scene, you have to realize this is the understatement of the morning. People are pretty intrigued with Jesus because he's been opening the eyes of blind people. This is a big deal. The things that happened up in Jericho between Zacchaeus and these blind guys getting healed, people are just like, oh my gosh, John even records people saying, and these were probably the people who had come from Jericho, where he had just healed these two blind men. John records people saying, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying?" Coming down from Jericho, they're like, "We just saw this guy open the eyes of two blind people. Could he not have kept this man from dying?" So there's a lot happening here. So there's this crowd, and there are family and friends gathered mourning. And John says that Jesus groaned in his spirit, and was troubled. The early church fathers, by the way, had a lot of discussion about the fact that John tells us very simply, Jesus wept. The early church fathers were fascinated by this because they wanted to know, why did Jesus weep? Did Jesus just weep because he was sad over his friend Lazarus? Maybe, but I think Jesus had a clue what he was about to do. Did Jesus weep because of the sadness? He was just caught up in the sorrow of his friends. Did Jesus weep for the reality of a fallen world where death reigns? Did Jesus weep for the darkness over the human condition that all that death represents? The fathers, they speculated over this, like, what was Jesus weeping for? And if you ask me, I would just say, maybe for all of it. This is what it is. This is what the incarnation is that God enters into our experience of existence. So then Jesus says to Mary, "Show me where you have laid him." This is beginning in verse 38. "And then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and there was a stone over the entrance. And Jesus said, 'Take away the stone.' And Martha, the sister of the man who had died, said to him, 'Lord, by this time there's a stench. He's been dead for 4 days.'" People always seem to be telling Jesus when things are not a great idea. Okay, all right, we get it, but it's not a great idea. And Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" And then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes, and he said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing here, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. It's interesting that Jesus says that they may believe that you sent me. Like, if you know the story, you know that we go from Bethany to another overnight, into Jerusalem for a week of battle with the religious leaders, at the end of which Jesus will be arrested and executed. And what he wants people, he's been low-key, but what he wants people to see is he wants them to understand out of this moment, out of what's going to happen, he wants them to understand that he has come from God. Not just his disciples, everybody. If it weren't Jesus, it would be arrogant. But it's not. Now, when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" Can you just imagine? Can you just imagine? And the one who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. By the way, I just want to say, maybe you assume this, but I'm going to say it, that I believe Jesus did this. I'm not what they call an anti-supernaturalist who says that Jesus could not have worked, miracles. Anti-supernaturalists look at the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and they say, well, Jesus didn't really multiply loaves and fish. The truth was, everybody had a peanut butter sandwich in their back pocket, and they were just kind of shy about bringing it out because they didn't know if other people had food. So they were being respectful, but then, when people started eating, they all brought it out and everybody ate, and there was even leftovers. I read this in scholarly books. So when the Gospels were written, there were still people alive who were familiar with all these events, who could have said, this stuff didn't happen. I think one of the greatest arguments for Jesus' own resurrection is the fact that the Romans were all upset about this story, that Jesus had been raised, but they didn't drag the body through the streets because there wasn't a body to be found. And then when the apostles went out preaching this stuff across the area and later wrote it down, people could have said, listen, that's not true. They dragged the body through the streets. This guy, this Lazarus thing never, but nobody, we don't have any record of anybody ever raising those kind of objections. Like, hey, we know these are lies. We saw what really happened. I'm not saying that proves anything. I'm just saying that, there were people who could have argued with these stories that didn't. And the gospel writers, they don't tell these stories with an attitude like, the gospel writers don't record the miracles like, yeah, it's no big deal, Jesus doing miracles. They record the miracles precisely because they're remarkable. They tell these stories precisely because they're out of the ordinary, precisely because they're almost unbelievable. So where did that Hosanna shouting Palm Sunday crowd come from? From Zacchaeus to the blind men, to the tomb of Lazarus, and then down that road, the crowd grows and it grows and it grows. And John, by the way, tells us that at least a few folks, when they saw Lazarus alive, actually ran into Jerusalem to tell the Pharisees and the chief priests about it, and that this actually becomes the impotence for the council at which they decide to execute Jesus. So people run into Jerusalem, they say, you guys aren't going to believe this, you're not going to like it. But Jesus just pulled a dead guy out of a grave. And they say, that's it. And they literally start to make a plan. We gotta kill him. I'm always fascinated that after being as secretive as he can be about a lot of his miracles for 3 years, do you know those stories in the Gospels? Jesus is frequently telling people, don't tell anybody about this. He heals somebody, he says, don't go show the priests, don't tell anybody else. In fact, a couple of the gospel writers mention the fact that Jesus does this. They reflect on the fact that Jesus has done this, telling people to kind of keep it on the down low because his time has not yet come. Like, if this thing gets too out of hand, Jesus says, no one takes my life from me. You know that verse? I lay it down, I take it up. This is on his timetable. But after he's as secretive as he can be about a lot of his miracles for 3 years, Jesus now raises Lazarus from the dead in front of, I don't know, hundreds? Potentially thousands of people. Many scholars believe thousands of people. And I really believe that this demonstration in front of the largest gathering of people is intentional on Jesus' part. You know, Jesus would often talk about doing things. David just preached about the blind man, and Jesus would say, that it wasn't because his parents sinned. That's not. It was for the glory of God. So Jesus would often bring up this phrase that in these things that I'm doing, it's for the glory of God. But John says that when Jesus first heard the news that Lazarus was sick, he said, "This sickness is not unto death, but that the Son of God might be glorified." Again, that would be arrogant if it was me or you. But Jesus is saying, this has happened so that I can go and wake our friend Lazarus, and everybody can see who I am and what I came to bring. I imagine the Father, after all of Jesus' secrecy across the years, I imagine the Father on this day, it's my Bible fantasy, so indulge me, leaning down and whispering to Jesus, "All right, show it to him. Do it. You sure? Yep. I'm going to pull out all stops. This is it." But there's something else we need to talk about when we think about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. We have to remember what we know about the way John has built his entire gospel, right? I've talked about this with you. Every story John tells is a metaphor for spiritual truth. In John 3 with Nicodemus, there's a spiritual truth. In John 4 with the woman at the well, the question is, do people even see what they're thirsty for? Right? Jesus says, he says to her, "If you'd known who I am, you would have asked me, and I would have given you living water." In John 5, it's the man at the pool. Are our lives not paralyzed? We're not really walking through this life. We need to be healed. In John 6, are we not hungry? Jesus says, "My flesh is real food." Are we not hungry? In John 8, it's the need for self-reflection, not judgment. You know that whole business with throwing the rocks, right? And Jesus is like, these people need to be awakened to self-reflection. In John 9, are we not all blind, right? David just preached that. This is what, at the end, Jesus, of that whole story, David just preached it, and they dragged the parents in, and they're all upset that this guy got healed. But at the end, he says, "This is what I came into the world for, so the blind would see. And those who claim to see would be revealed as blind." So all John's stories are to tell a spiritual truth. There's the physical thing that happened, and then there's what John's really trying to show us out of it. Jesus comes to satisfy our thirst, to heal us so we can walk, to be our bread of life, to wake us up to our inner self, to open our blind eyes. This is John's gospel. All these stories, it's all actually about us. That's the story he's telling. What's interesting is that he starts with the story of Nicodemus in John chapter 3, where the point is that somehow a person has to start over. You remember that conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus? He says to Nicodemus, "Listen, let me tell you something. If a man is not born again, he'll never be able to see and enter the kingdom of God." And Nicodemus says, "How can a man be born when he's old? How's that possible?" But Jesus is saying, unless there's a rebirth of some kind, you're not gonna take this journey that you need to take. So that's in John chapter 3. And then he caps off these other miracles across his gospel with the story of Jesus rebirthing Lazarus out of death. Do you see the bookends? Unless there's a rebirth, unless there's a starting over, unless there's somehow and to start over, you'd have to do what? I don't know, you'd have to probably die. There's a whole New Testament theme there. You'd have to die to start over, right? And we get to the end, and what happens? He literally, physically raises a dead man back to life. Now, you could think that I'm just being kind of fanciful and wanting to see all that in John if you want. But let me tell you what John describes Jesus doing when he appears to the disciples after the resurrection. Stands in front of them and he goes. He breathes on them. There's only one other place you see that in the Bible. You know where it is? Back in the book of Genesis. When God takes the dust of the ground, the dirt of the earth, the terra firma, and he makes a man. But the man isn't animate. He's not alive. And then it says, and God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Listen to this. And he became a living being. When Jesus breathes on the disciples, he's saying, so let's try this living being thing over again. Let's start all over. And then there's the fact that resurrection from death becomes the primary image in the early church for thinking about what it means to know Christ and experience in him a transforming spiritual journey. In fact, it is the image of Christian baptism. I don't know if you know that. We've done so many things with baptism, and I'm not being critical. Many different forms of baptism are beautiful and have some great spiritual truth laced into them, whether you're sprinkling or pouring or dunking or whatever you're doing. So I'm not being critical of how people baptize. But many people don't know what the original imagery of baptism is, and here it is. It shows up all across the New Testament, but it shows up here in Paul's Romans letter, chapter 6. Or do you not know that as many of us as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? And then listen to this. He says, therefore, if we were buried with him in baptism under the water, then just as Christ was raised, we too have been raised to walk in newness of life. That's what the verse says. Death and resurrection. This is the primary way that the early church thought about taking a transforming journey in Jesus, was death and resurrection. And I could take you all across the New Testament letters and I could show you how over and over again this picture of resurrection as the primary image for our spiritual journey. That to be on a spiritual journey with Christ is to be resurrected. And by the way, don't let anybody tell you that there's this discontinuity between Jesus and Paul. If you read any theology at all, you've probably come across this view that says Jesus was just this Jewish rabbi who was trying to do a thing for Israel. And then, Paul came along and he got a hold of these ideas about Jesus, and he created Christianity as we know it today, and he morphed it from something Jesus never intended into some whole other thing. So when you read the New Testament letters, especially Paul's letters, you're reading something that really Paul concocted that doesn't really represent, what Jesus taught and what Jesus had in mind, during his earthly ministry. And I don't believe that at all, because it's Jesus that I see talking about rebirth. And it's Jesus that I see raising Lazarus from the dead, and it's Jesus that I see breathing on the disciples. And then I get to Paul's letters, John too, but especially Paul's letters, and all over the place Paul is saying, so here's what we need. We need a rebirth, right? We need to be raised from the dead. We need the breath of God to come on us and change us. Oh, that sounds like what Jesus was doing and saying to me. And I want to tell you that I think one of the great weaknesses of modern Christianity is that we have not understood spiritual rebirth. We have not understood spiritual resurrection. We've focused on, in some parts of the church, we focused on doctrine and morality. It's all about just becoming a Bible head and getting all our doctrines right, and it's about everybody keeping the rules, And in other parts of the church, we focused on what I call tips and tricks. Like, hey, Jesus is not bad. We got a couple pointers for your marriage, and so you should come to church because it's cool. And that's all right too. Everything has its place. I get that. But we focused on doctrine, morality, tips and tricks, making sure people get saved so they can go to heaven. And there are important questions. They're important. I'm not being overly critical. There are good things bound up with all those questions. But we have not talked enough about or understood well enough the death that we carry around in our lives in the form of our fears and our blindness and the dysfunction that leads to more dysfunction, that leads to our selfishness, and that makes it impossible for us to be people of genuine and steadfast love. Because if you don't know that yet, you're going to hear it around here a lot. The end game of this whole thing is being recreated into people who are actually capable of genuine and steadfast love. It's all that death that we carry around in our fears and our blindness and our dysfunction in ourselves that makes it impossible to be human beings as human beings were gloriously made to be in the image of the divine wholeness and goodness. Well, I wish somebody would have taught me this 30 years ago. Let me illustrate this on the tablet of my own soul. I used to be a lot more afraid in my life. I used to be blind to the motives of my own heart, for real. I used to be more confused about what mattered in life. I used to not know what would quench my thirst or where to find the path of joy, what that looked like and how you get there and what will keep you from getting there. And I still have a long way to go, but let me tell you something. In all these things, I am being raised from the dead. That's it. I am being raised from the dead, and it's good. It's so good. This is the journey out of death into life. It's not just like, hey, I prayed the prayer, got saved, going to heaven. That's the life. Really, how much death are you still carrying around? How much dysfunction is still ruling your life? How much in you still needs to be changed? How many of your fears still need to be vanquished? I was very sneaky with you this morning. I intentionally didn't read the very best line in the whole Lazarus story, but I'm going to read it to you now. Are you ready? Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind that man and let him go." That's pretty exciting. I tore a page in my Bible doing that. Do you understand? This is what Jesus is saying over your life. Unbind that man and let him go. Unbind that woman and let her go. And one of the wonders that rises up before our eyes as we come to enter into Jesus' passion in this Holy Week, if you will see it, is the ironies that are woven into what we did to Jesus through these events. What we did to the God of the universe ensconced in human flesh. That he should thirst and ask us for a drink. Remember that? It's on the cross and he says, "I thirst." Try to get your mind around that. The living water is thirsty. That we should strip naked the one who set an innocently naked man and woman in a garden long ago. That we should blindfold the one who sees all. Do you remember that? It's in Matthew's Gospel. They covered his eyes, and then the soldiers struck him and said, "Prophesy, which one of us hit you?" That we should blindfold the one who sees all. Some of you may remember that 5 years ago, I wrote a Good Friday poem. I won't read it all to you this morning, but it was about these very questions. And I'm going to read you one stanza of it. It's about the idea that we should attempt to that we who are blind should attempt to blindfold God. It goes like this. But lo, in clothing of fear and anger, this is us, and from caverns of despair within, on which they dared not gaze, blind by curse and will conjoined, they stripped thee till thou stoodst naked before thine own creation. And in irony unrivaled, didst the blind attempt to shroud thine eyes, and make blind swings at him who sees both sparrow's nest and ocean's deep. Every year, I try to get my mind around, and it's hard to do. I try to get my mind around the humiliation in this idea that the God who is love, who has come to heal, who has come to put us back together, the God who gives us breath and life and all things, should stand in a courtyard, stripped naked, thirsty, hungry, blindfolded, whipped, beaten, and mocked. What I want to say to you about that this morning is this. That's how much you mean to him. That he would do this. And I always think that he must have been hoping that in retrospect, even this morning, that we would see the spectacle of this as so bizarre that it would wake us up. It would wake us up. This is the love of God. He would suffer at your hands before he would destroy you. It is the way of love. It is the way of goodness. It is the way of peace. And it is this way that he invites us to. God loves you like that. I hope you never, ever forget it.